Sure. Does everyone saw the link to the doc? Okay. So yeah, Alex asked me to just have an overview kind of the decomposition work that we have done, and so that everyone is on the same page. I'm not sure, what everyone knows about it. Some people like Simon has been working on other things a lot, and Matt too, I know. So hopefully I don't say everything that things that people already know, but at least hopefully everyone will understand the basics. So just for the overview right now, for the current status of it, and I'm not super up to date on it, but phase 4 was fully deployed on production. And that's using a separate connection for the CI and main database, but still pointing at the same primary. So the next step really is the final step, which is actually splitting those to read from two separate, or to talk to two separate clusters. And that's the current work that's ongoing now is all in support of that. So I think we've found recently in the last couple of weeks, there's been some things with migrations and how that's working in the migration 2.0 that need to be addressed first. But and also I think they're still discussing, testing the rollout plan and how that's all going to play out. So just sort of, and this is not something I'm very familiar with either because I didn't really work on this, but just for everyone's understanding, in CI, we have these query analyzers that run, and that's basically supporting how we make sure that we're not doing these cross-database queries. And so I put the directory in the document there where they live in. Really, someone from sharding team knows more about that than me since they did all that work. But basically, we're detecting, that a query in CI, we're detecting that a query doesn't join two tables that are on different databases, and also that we're not talking to two databases in the same transaction, or writing to two databases in the same transaction. So that's basically from the application side, how we're verifying that everything is working there. So that's just a quick piece, if you weren't aware of that, because I know people have questioned before, how do we know that that's happening? And also the CI now is working in decompose mode by default. So if you want to run for some reason single database test, there's a flag that you can add. There's a single database flag that you can add to the MR, and that will run also in the single database mode. If you want to test something specifically, say for self-managed, and make sure it's working properly, but otherwise decompose is the default on pipelines now.
Pat, on the query analyzers front, so there's the way we distinguish which tables belong to which database is still the YAML file, right?
Right, yeah.
Is that going to be sticking around, or do we have plans to change that at some point?
As far as I know, I have not heard discussion of plans to get rid of that file. I think that's still the way that we have it working right now. And I linked to the file there, this GitLab schemas, if people aren't familiar with that, but that's basically where we have a schema, or GitLab schema, which is basically an abstraction of the database. So there's GitLab main, which is then saying that anything that talks to the GitLab main schema can talk to the main database and the shared database. And then the same for CI, that it can talk to CI and then the shared database tables. So yeah, that ties into the next part then, is how the migrations work with this migration 2.0. I'm sure you saw the things in Slack about that and everything. But the general overview there, if you're not familiar, is that we're making a hard rule basically that we have to split the DDL and the DML in migrations. And this is going way back to the very beginning of the project. Basically, to ease the transition, I think we said that we were going to keep the main and the CI database to have the same schema, at least for the foreseeable future. Maybe in some point down the road that would change, but certainly makes the rollout easier. Since we're using replication, we really have to do that anyways. So we're splitting the DDL and the DML, and then in the DDL type migration, you don't have to do anything differently than you would do with the migration now, and it's just going to run that DDL change against both databases. And then with the DML, then that's when you're putting this restrict GitLab migration, I think it's called, and you're saying specifically what schema it should be able to talk to. And then it's only going to run against that specific database. And so the background migrations are part of that. That background migrations would be considered DML, even if it's just doing scheduling or whatever for the batch background migrations. That's considered DML, so we would only run the batch background migrations or any background migration against a single database. So we have the single database, which I call the database basically where the records go. I call that the tracking database. That's where the tracking data for the migration is living. And then, but once the migration job starts running, there's really nothing preventing it from being able to talk wherever it needs to talk. So you can still do the migration local models and add, you know, something that talks to CI and something that talks to main. And as long as you're not cross joining and things, of course, then there's no reason you can't do that. And so that's also kind of the issue that we had with this finalized recently that came up, which is we had a call yesterday with Camille. Just basically we have the finalize, and that's trying to run a background migration job in line from the migration, from the Rails migration. And the way that Rails migration is run is it is basically hijacking active record base and establishing connection to the correct database. So then the normal connection handling doesn't work quite the way that we expect it to. And so from that call, Camille mentioned, and makes sense, that really from the beginning, it would probably have been better if we were using application record rather than active record base to talk to the main database. And then we are only ever using something that's an application record, and we know we're always getting the correct connection. So I think that's a long-term goal eventually, but that's a big change to make now at this stage of the game. So the plan is just to work around that for the time being. Oh, and the other thing too with the migrations is there was this new addition of this new class called migration record, which is basically a replacement then for active record base. So rather than, if you want to write a model local to the Rails migration, rather than inheriting from active record base, you would inherit from this migration record. So that's basically just, you know, like an abstraction there.
So I looked at the definition of that, and the class is basically empty. Does active record base know that it's been subclassed and disable its own magic?
I don't know, honestly.
Okay, that's fair. No worries. Okay.
I think it just works like any other model would work, but it's just so we're not, you know, referencing active record base directly. So if we need to change that later down the road, then that's easier to do. But yeah, I don't really know how it works. That's a Camille question, probably.
Sounds good.
And then so the other piece of that ties in with the background migrations is the connection management in these shared models. So we have the shared model there, which I think everyone is probably familiar with that to some extent. And basically what we're just doing there is we're allowing to override the connection on a per thread basis. So basically we have these models that we use that inherit from that, the batch background migration models, the partitioning models, like all the PG schema tables that we have, like the PG index, PG class that wrap the PG catalog stuff. They're all using the shared model. And then basically you just wrap this in the block, and it's going to override the connection for the duration of that block. So you can point it to main, you can point it to CI, and then, you know, talk to where you need to talk. So those shared tables are basically, in a sense, they're like, I guess like sharded or something, that they're on, like living on all the database kind of, I mean, not really, but sort of like that, I guess, or mirrored, to use a better word. So that would be where this GitLab shared schema comes in. So that would include all those tables. The GitLab, the PG catalog tables would all be part of GitLab shared. Information schema is part of the GitLab shared, like any database specific tables that we would need to access outside of the application are also part of GitLab shared. And so then how that works specifically with the background migration. So we have the legacy background migrations and the batch background migrations. So for the old background migrations, we have two workers. There's a worker for main, there's a worker for CI, and they basically know which database they need to talk to. It's like hard-coded in the worker. And then when we would schedule the job. When the migration runs, we use the same method that we use now, which is like the queue background migration by interval or whatever. And it's basically, it would look at like the connection name. So it's going to say, oh, the connection name is main. Therefore, I'll get the worker that talks to main, and then everything kind of keys off that. And if it's CI, then it would use CI. So that's how it's scheduling through Sidekick to the specific worker, basically by the connection name to the database it's talking to. So like in the current state that we have right now, it's still hard coded to use main only because we're not really like 100% sure how we'll roll that out. And we had the migration 2.0, which isn't finalized yet. So right now, everything is still being scheduled directly on main, which isn't an issue since main and CI are the same primary right now. So like the CI worker is basically never doing anything because nothing is ever being scheduled against CI. And that's how it will be on self-managed too. That CI background migration worker is just, it's never going to have a job scheduled against it. So it'll never have anything to do. For the batch background migrations, it's a little different there since we're using Sidekick cron to run everything. So it's not based on the jobs being scheduled. It's based on the database state. So that for there, we also added 2 workers. So there's, again, a worker for main and a worker for CI. And they're looking, they know which database they're looking at basically. And since the CI worker would basically always be running, but there's not any work for it to do right now, or we wouldn't want it to run basically because it would see the same jobs that main is seeing. We just have a feature flag there and the feature flag is turned off. So then once we were past the cutover, we have 2 separate databases and the data is in the right state, then we could turn the CI feature flag on and then that worker will just start picking up jobs in the CI database and running them. So that's the part that I think there's still discussion around. And I can, I'll find the issue and link it in this doc. But so we talked a little bit about the rollout process for the background migrations. And I think for the legacy migrations, particularly, I don't know that there's really a clear plan how that would work. It will probably basically be like manually, we'll have to say at some point prior to the cutover, like don't schedule any new background migrations because there's not really a great way to handle that because of it being in Sidekick, but then having stayed in the database, and there's no way to pause execution. So it's just running sort of through the cutover and things might get sort of mixed up a bit. So I think for the old background migrations, there's going to have to be some manual process to manage that, or like a process step ahead of time to basically prevent that from happening. For the batch background migrations, what I suggested, and I think Camille had a different solution, which maybe is better, but at least at a bare minimum, we can basically, each of the workers has a feature flag. We can turn those feature flags off and then neither worker will do anything. We do the cutover. At that point, we have the main database and the CI database that data is mirrored at that point. Basically, you would have to like go in the main database and delete any CI related migrations if there are any. In the CI database, you delete any main related migrations. Then you turn the features flag back on and it just picks up where it left off. Everything should be good. So I think what Camille suggested in the issue was, actually now I can't remember, maybe Diego remembers, but I'll find the issue and link it. But it was, I think, automating that some way to make it a little bit simpler.
So when the migrations get scheduled on either database, but when the job actually runs, does it have a connection to each one, or does it only get a connection to its own database?
So it gets past the connection to its own database. And then if you want to talk to the other database, you just have to create a model or something, or use the application record basically to talk there.
Okay,
so
that makes sense.
Yeah, and the reason it passes the connection to its own database is so that we have, generic job like the copy column job that we use for the primary key. Then it doesn't know what model it has because it only has a table and a column name. And then it just talks to wherever that connection, wherever the data is stored.
So that makes sense. So what do we get by having sharded, like moving this table to shared, as opposed to just keeping all the job definitions on main and establishing the right connection?
Yeah, right. We did talk about that. And at this point, I don't really remember all.
Oh, no, I'm not saying we should fix it. I'm just trying to understand.
That's a fair question. I think we went back and forth on that, at the time when we were deciding this. And I think the reason we decided to keep it fully isolated was just thinking that gives us more operational flexibility, because we can basically say like the CI worker is its own thing. We can just turn that off, or we could pause migrations on one database or the other.
Sure.
And it just seemed like a better fit or like a better separation of concerns. The one point that was brought up against that, which also makes sense, is like if we continue to decompose databases in the future and when down the road there's like 5 or 10 or whatever databases, then maybe that becomes unwieldy because then you have 10 workers and then everything is kind of, that's for in the future that's probably not,
Yeah.
no one cares right now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks. So we're going to have to start worrying about in reviews, there might be 2 background migrations going at the same time. And, you know, if you're depending on state, like there could be weird self-managed cases around that, I think.
Yeah, so it'll be a little different for sure because the GitLab migrations on main and CI can potentially run in parallel, like one on main and one on CI, but on self-managed, everything will still run basically single threaded because for now, they're only going to have one database. So the CI worker will still just be, you know, off by default, basically.
Gotcha.
And I think there's, you know, there's a good bit of, it's going to be kind of, I think, tricky for the time being, and it's going to be new for the development team and figuring out like how are they using the right connection and how are they talking to where they need to talk and how that, you know, it's confusing, I think. And I know Camille just recently added a cop basically saying in a background migration job, don't use active record base, only use application record or CI application record, which is to help clarify that you always know you're talking to main and you always know you're talking to CI. And we're also trying to enforce that or I added a cop, which is in review, that the background migration jobs, at least for the batch background migrations, are inheriting from this subclass that we provide, and then that has the connection information there, and try to abstract some of that so they don't have to really maybe understand as well how that works in depth. But yeah, it's definitely tricky, I think, and it's a little, yeah, I don't know, that's probably something that can be improved for sure.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
So I think that was it for the batch background migrations. So then there's other database features we made to work with multiple databases. Those are pretty straightforward. I think like partitioning is pretty straightforward. It's just running, I think it's iterating over all the models that are there and saying, oh, this model's on main, connect to main and run the partitioning management. Oh, this model's on CI, connect to CI and run. So you're only going to ever have the partitions for those tables where that table would naturally live, even though the schema is mirrored, like a CI, or I mean like audit events, for example, is partition. It's only going to have the partitions on the main database, not on the CI database. Since that's part of the GitLab schema, which isn't tracked in structure.sql, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the mirroring at all. So there's really, but I think there is some weirdness around, which maybe you've seen, which is that pgdump doesn't really like that. So when the table is partitioned, it says, oh, this table has other tables that are dependent on it. So I'm going to move it to the very top of the dump file so that I make sure I create that table before I create the partitions, which is why you see this diff of like the partition tables moving back and forth all the time, which is really unfortunate. And there was like discussion at some point. I think there's the issue that maybe down the road we would just have to create all the partitions everywhere all the time to work around that, which is like not really the right solution, but also unless anyone wants to patch pgdump, probably not, then that's like where we're at, I think so. And the reindexing is also a multi-database feature that works again the same way. I think those tables are all shared between the databases, and the rake test and everything all work when they take a database parameter now. And so you're just saying, I want to reindex, X index on main database, and it will run there. And I think it's also split too, so that eventually there could be 2 separate crons that run that, and we can run, reindexing in parallel in both databases on the weekends and things. So I think those were all the big features that I could think of. There's, a lot of the rake tests have been updated to accept a main or CI parameter if multiple databases are present. There's a kind of the pattern that we're following how Rails does it, where, if you have like db::migrate, then you would do db::migrate main, or db::migrate::CI. And so we do that same pattern in most of our migration or most of our rake tests. And that seems to work out pretty well. I don't know if I don't know. Was there things I said that didn't make sense, or things that I should talk about more?
It all makes sense to me. Do you know much about, in the call yesterday, Camille was talking about like pressure on PG bouncer due to increased numbers of connections? That's just because we're basically all doubling our connections during phase 4, right?
Right, yeah. So that will be resolved once, because there's separate PG bouncers in front of the CI cluster. So once CI starts pointing at the CI cluster for real, then those will go to a separate set of PG bouncers, and then we'll have this really the same distribution we have now, or even less, really, because we'll probably need less connections overall.
Okay.
So yeah, that's just a temporary state we're in.
It's a little spooky that we were more than halfway to the limit before, but yeah. Okay.
And the state today, you mentioned we split connections to the primary. Do we also split them to the replicas already?
Yeah, so the replicas are already, that was phase 3, which was the prior phase. So yeah, since the CI cluster is being replicated from the primary, just like in the main replicas, there's phase 3 was already reading, so we're already doing CI reads from the CI cluster.
Sure, okay. So right now we have logically separated things, but it's still on the same physical cluster and the same physical PG bouncers. And then going forward, we also do the physical switch to the separate cluster.
Well, this, I guess, are you talking about the main or the replicas? Or I mean the primary or the replica, the writes or the reads connections? There's a lot of terminology.
Isn't both the same in that sense?
Well, for like a read-write connection, it's the same. So there's main connection, there's CI connection, they're all pointing at the same primary, because there's only one primary. And then, but for there's like the current set of replicas that are coming from the primary, which are for main. And then there's a new CI cluster, which is also being replicated from main. And so the CI connections are pointing at this new CI cluster for the reads only, though.
Gotcha. Okay. So for replicas, we already have physically separated things.
Yeah.
You could say.
Yeah.
And okay, yeah, that makes sense. Is there some sort of overview for infrastructure side of this? Like, how does it look today? What are the next steps?
That's a good question. I can look. So everything is linked off. Probably linked off. There was the main epic that has the 7 phases, which is the epic is 6160. And I think everything is probably still linked from there, but I haven't been following the rollout as closely recently because I wasn't really working directly on that anymore. But yeah, so I think like phase 6 was more the infrastructure setup and test phase, like test the rollout and rollback and roll on and rollback. So phase 6 was more of an infrastructure phase of the rollout, and then phase 7 is actually splitting the connections, or having the database in a state that the connections are totally split on 2 primaries. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions? Or I mean, I don't really know if there's anything else that I can talk about that I guess that makes sense. Or I can't think of anything right now. Anyways.
Makes sense to me.
What do you think is the biggest challenge completing that? If you would have to name one.
Yeah, well, I think the background migration rollout is still up for debate. Yeah, I really have to find that issue. So I think there's some, and I think that also, making sure the developers are using it the right way. And I think that's going to make their database reviews sort of tricky, to make sure that that's all working the right way. So I think that's definitely, like a big challenge, at least for this team. And then and then of course the actual like cutover, I think which this team really won't be working on, but that's pretty tricky also too. And especially because we have, and I don't even really know what the resolution to this has been, but because we have these shared tables that are being replicated, so then basically after the split, then you basically have duplicate data in those tables. So the other tables, it doesn't matter because nothing will be looking at those. But for the shared tables, it does matter because if, the application is going to be looking at either one or the other and maybe see the same state here and the same state there. So somehow there has to be like a way to, like say the, some of these things aren't maybe that critical, like say like reindexing, the reindexing tables are in both. So that doesn't really matter if the data is on the CI side for a little bit because it's not going to affect anything. But say like the loose foreign keys, that's a shared table. So that's another feature that's like that. So basically then you're going to have, data living on main, and then that same data is mirrored on CI, and then somehow you have to break that apart and then, handle that. And maybe Adam has already coded that in such a way that will take that into account. I don't know, but I think I think that's not really super well known. And I think just due to the, desire to keep the cutover as short as possible, that's like tricky because you can't be doing the cutover and then running all these scripts or something like that to clean up all the data. It makes it sort of tricky. But yeah, I don't know that there's really a good plan, or I don't know how far they have got with that actual testing of the rollout, because then we started seeing all these other application level blockers that came up before we even got to that point. So I think that there's been a lot of focus on fixing those other pieces of the app that aren't working correctly.
And the cleanup scripting you mentioned, is that something that already exists to some extent, or have we planned on doing that at some point, or any discussion in that regard?
No. Yeah, I know eventually like the plan after the cutover was that probably the tables would be truncated on the other, like on the CI database, we would truncate all the main tables and vice versa. And I think that's still the plan to do that like some point relatively soon after the cutover. But yeah, I don't know what really the status of it is. And I just thought too, I just remembered what I think what Camille had suggested for the batch background migrations is basically we would add a parameter or a new column on the table, which is containing the GitLab schema. And then that migration, basically that main worker and the CI worker will run, and then they would only pull for jobs that have the schema that they're looking for. So the main job would only try to run jobs that have GitLab main or however it's flagged there. And then that could be like a temporary column that's just added for the duration of the cutover. And then once it's done, we could, we wouldn't really need that information anymore. So that makes sense. And that would make it that less, at least less manual process. So maybe that's something that could be looked at for the other shared tables too. That makes sense.
Just thought we could do cascading truncates and see if we got all the foreign keys right. Yeah, we should have them right because, with all that analysis going on up front in the code base.
Yeah. And there's well, I forget how they verify that the foreign keys aren't, that there's not foreign keys cross database. I don't know if there's an automated check for that or how that works. I forget now. But I think it will complain if you try to add one. Well, now, certainly now it won't work because the database is running Decompose in CI, so it wouldn't work anyways. But So I guess if nobody has anything else, we can call it a day, call it the end of the call.
Speak now. Thank you, Pat,
Yeah,
very
sure.
much for this overview. And thanks everybody for getting together and asking them some questions. And good luck with what's next.
Thanks.